Hi guys. So welcome to our presentation on farmers and the populist movement. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right, so here we go. So hopefully at this point you've already watched this video. If you haven't already watched this video, then pause this video that I'm doing now and go ahead and click play on these slides. Because it is a little bit harder to watch if I were to record it now. So I do want you to watch that on your own. Assuming that you already have watched that video and you went to this slide and clicked here and that's what you're watching now, then awesome job, you are right on track. So let's go ahead and continue to talk about inflation. Let's review kind of what we just learned. So results of inflation. So what happens when we have inflation? Prices rise and the purchasing power of money decreases. So what does that mean? Inflation is just saying that there's more money in the economy. And typically when there's more money in the economy, that means that people are willing to spend more money on things because now you have money. If before you were only making $10 an hour at your job and now you're making $15 an hour at your job, you now have more money. You'd probably be more willing to go to the movie theater. You're probably willing to go out to eat and so on and so forth. And if your job went from $10 to $15 an hour, then probably everyone else's job went up too. That's inflation. It's when it can happen with lots of different things. It can happen if the government gives money to everybody. It could happen if a minimum wage goes up and everybody starts making more money at their jobs. And so your money is worth less than it was before. It's not worthless, don't get that confused, but it's worth less than it was before. So for example, if you used to go to the movies and you used to pay $10 for a movie ticket, let's say the people working at the movie theater were making $10 an hour. And now all of a sudden the people at the movie theater are making $15 an hour. So movie theater needs to make more money to pay their employees more money. So now your movie ticket's going to go up to $15 an hour. So your $10 is no longer as valuable as it used to be. You used to be able to go to the movies for $10, and now you no longer can go to the movies with those $10. So let's talk about who likes inflation, who wins when there's inflation, and who loses when there's inflation. So people who are the first ones to get the new money typically win because the prices haven't gone up yet. So if you're the first person to get a pay raise and no one else has, you're like, score, prices haven't gone up, I'm making more money, awesome. Also, who wins in inflation is people who are in debt because the money they owe is worth less than the money that they borrowed. So for example, let's say you borrowed $100 from the bank. And you said, okay, bank, I'm going to borrow this $100. And when I pay you back, I'm going to give you $110 back. So that interest, that $10 interest that you're paying is the cost of borrowing money. So the bank's willing to loan you their $100. And in return, when you pay them back, you're going to have to pay them $110 back. And so people who are in debt like inflation. Let's say you are a farmer and you need to borrow $100 to buy some farming equipment so you can grow your farm. And so the bank gives you $100, you take the $100, you promise to pay it back with $110 inflation. Let's say at this time you are selling, you're selling, let's say you grow pumpkins, you're a pumpkin farmer. Let's say you sell all your pumpkins for $5. Well, how many pumpkins are you going to have to sell before you can pay back your $110? Well, let's see, 100, just use a calculator for this. So let's see if I did, blurry, if I did 110, can I make it not blurry? 110 divided by 5, I get, sorry, you can't see it, but I get 22. So 110 divided by 5 is 22. So I have to sell 22 pumpkins for $5 each. 22 people have to pay me $5 before I will have enough money, $110, to pay back the bank what I owe them. But now let's say I get 10 years to pay back that loan. Let's say within those 10 years, inflation occurs, and now I sell my pumpkins for $10 each because everything costs a little bit more money. Prices went up, people are getting paid more. I can now sell my pumpkins for $10 each. Well, now how much do I have to work and how many pumpkins do I need to sell to be able to pay back that bank? $110. Well, 110 divided by 10 is 11. So without inflation, I would have had to sell 22 pumpkins. So it's 22 pumpkins I'd have to plant, water, grow, market to the people and try to get them to buy. I would have had to do 22, but now I only need to sell 11 pumpkins to pay back the bank the $110 that I owe them. So I, as a farmer, love inflation. It makes the money worth less, which means it makes my debt not as much. $110 used to buy you 22 pumpkins. Now it only buys you 11. My money, my physical money is actually worth less than it used to. The purchasing power has decreased. So as somebody who borrows money, I like inflation. So if you, for example, take out a student loan to go to college, you might like inflation because you're going to have to pay interest on that loan, and the money that you owe will be worth less if inflation occurs. People who lose from inflation, a lot of people who are not in debt lose money on inflation because their money is worth less. So let's say you don't take out any loans. Let's say you worked hard and you have, $200 in the bank, in your bank account, and that $200 used to be able to buy, let's say I wanted to buy pumpkins again, 200 divided by 5, back when pumpkins cost $5. I used to say, okay, this money is worth 40 pumpkins at $5 each. But now with inflation, with pumpkins costing $10 each, now say 200 divided by 10 is 200 divided by 10 is 20. So this much money, as just a consumer who has my money, I used to be able to buy 40 pumpkins, but now I can only buy 20. My money, the purchasing power of my money has gone down. Kind of like, think of it like this. Let's say right now, our market has kind of settled, and the way people are earning class dollars in our class, I can sell all of these goods in here for $50, 50 class dollars. And that seems to be good. So for 50 class dollars, you can buy some popcorn chips. I got like a pretzel candy. We got some lifesavers from Miss Lynn. We got some cute stationery. So all of this stuff used to be what you could buy for $50. That's your purchasing power of your money. So if you have $200 right now, you could buy 4 items from the $50 container. But, let's say I, Miss Stewart, I just start going crazy and I just start giving out $100 bills and everybody's getting $100. You might at first, again, if you're the first one to start getting $100, you might be like, sweet, I can start buying a lot more stuff from this $50 bin. But once everyone has $50, I need to raise my prices. Otherwise, the student store, like everyone's just going to buy everything out and I won't have anything to sell. So with the increase in the money supply in the class, I need to increase my prices. So again, if there was inflation in the class, if I started handing out a bunch of $100 bills, I would also have to raise my prices. So now to buy the same thing, you now have to pay $75. So if you're somebody who, if you were the first one to get $100 before I raised my prices, you'd be like, sweet, you could buy everything. But if not, if you just kind of, if you had all your old money, you're like, great, this $200, I used to be able to buy 4 things, but now I can't buy as much. Now I can only buy 3 things from the $75 bin instead of 4 things from the $50 bin. So then it's the same thing that you're buying, but my money buys me less stuff now. That's inflation. And other people who lose from inflation, typically banks or anybody who loans their money out. Like if you were that farmer, again, if I was the farmer and I borrowed the $100 to buy my farm supplies, and the bank, I told the bank I'd pay them back $110 in 10 years. That money that I pay them is now worth less. That $10 is not as great as it used to be because everything costs more now. So here's the government's role in inflation. So how can the government create inflation? They can do this with that term we learned, debasement, which is creating money that is not backed by tangible metals. Metals meaning gold or silver. And the government, we used to have all of our money was backed by metals, which meant as much cash as there was in the economy, that's how much gold we had in the government vault. And so at any time you could take your $100, anybody could, the whole world, or sorry, the whole country could have taken their cash and gone to the bank and said, I want to exchange my $100 for $100 worth of gold. And the whole country could have done that at the same time, and they could have just gone back to the gold. People used to pay gold. That's used to be how we trade, but we decided it's easier just to trade cash than to trade gold because it's easier to break down into smaller amounts. And it's easier to carry and it's easier to give change. All of that's easier. So that's why we carry cash instead of gold. But again, the cash used to just represent the gold. But we'll learn that one way the government can create inflation is to say, never mind, we only have this much gold in our vault, but we're just going to start printing cash and giving it out. So it increases the money supply. And they can also do this to pay government employees. The government doesn't typically just throw money out into the economy. How they do that, how they put more money into the economy is to pay people to do things for government. So for example, like I'm a government employee. As a teacher, the government pays me. If I worked for Google, I'm not a government employee. I work for Google. Or if I work for McDonald's, I'm not a government employee. McDonald's pays me. But the government can pay all their government employees more, or they can hire more people to do jobs and print money to pay them to do like construction jobs, for example, and then there's more money in the economy. Or what we saw a lot during this pandemic was the government was printing like COVID relief checks, and people would randomly get checks in the mail for $1,000 to try to help out with the pandemic. And that also we saw caused a lot of inflation. Our inflation this year is up way more than it has been in a very long time. And a lot of that has to do with the government giving checks out to a lot of people. Because, you know, the government, people weren't spending money when the pandemic happened because a lot of people weren't working or they couldn't work or they were sick for whatever reason. And so the government said, well, we need to boost the economy. So they sent out $1,000 checks to everybody. And then people said, sweet, I got $1,000. I'm going to go buy a barbecue, or I'm going to go to the movies, or I'm going to go out to eat. And so more money was being used in the economy. If a hyperinflation is when the government's inflationary schemes get out of control. So that's when the government's handing out so much money that it leads to hyperinflation, where prices skyrocket and money eventually has no value. So that's the fear. Sometimes you're like, why can't the government just print out money and we can all be millionaires? If we did, it would lead to this hyperinflation. And again, things wouldn't be worth, like I wouldn't be willing to sell things at my student store for $50 or $75 if everybody had billions of class dollars, because like it wouldn't be worth anything. Why would I want to sell? If I had billions of dollars, why would I want to sell my products for $10? It doesn't matter. And so eventually your money's worth less and becomes crazy. So now let's go back to farmers. We're talking about the Gilded Age. So this is the period at the late 1800s, early 1900s in our country. And this, think back to when we did the Wizard of Oz video notes. And we talked about how the Wizard of Oz was an allegory, which is just a fancy word for metaphor, or a story that represents this time in our country's history, the Gilded Age. So let's kind of go through this, and then we can, at the end, review our Wizard of Oz notes and go through how that makes sense. So again, these farmers in the Gilded Age, they were in debt. They had taken out loans, just like Miss Stewart over here for my pumpkin farm. I took out a loan from the bank that they had to pay back with interest. So let's talk about Farmer Joe. I just made up Farmer Joe. let's pretend Farmer Joe, he took out a loan of $1,000 in 1888 to buy the equipment for his farm. He agreed to pay back the money 12 years later in 1900 plus $100 of interest. So he has to pay back that $1,000 he borrowed plus $100 interest, which is the cost of borrowing money. In the year 1988, Joe could sell his apples for 30 cents a pound and his wheat for 40 cents a pound. He averaged selling 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of 15 pounds of wheat a month. So he made about $108 a year. So here's the math. You have 30 cents times 10, because it's 10 pounds of apples, 30 pounds an apple, plus 40 cents per pound times 15 pounds. So that's how much he usually made a month. And then I multiply it by 12 because there's 12 months in a year. And that's where he typically makes $108 a year. So his yearly salary, $108, is 9.8% of what he owes to the bank. He owes $1,100. So in 1 year, he makes 9.8% of the total amount he has to pay back to the bank. If there is 10% inflation by the year 1900, Farmer Joe will now sell his apples for 33 cents a pound and his wheat for 44 cents a pound. So 10 cents, so if we go back, 10% of 30 is 3. So 30 cents, if it goes up 10%, it's going to be 33. 10% of 40 is 4. It's like 1/10 of 40 is 4. So if it increases by 10%, this now becomes 44 cents per pound. So that's where we get these two. The apples are 33 cents a pound, wheat is 44 cents a pound. That's if there's 10% inflation. He still averages selling 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of wheat a month. So he's not doing any more work than he was before. But inflation has happened. Prices have gone up. He's still selling the same amount. He's still working the same amount. But now he makes $118 every year. So there's the math for that. His yearly salary is now 10.7% of what he owes to the bank. So his salary used to be less than 10% of what he owes. Now that it's more than 10% of what he owes, which means it's going to take him less time to make that $1,100. In 1888, and so now let's go back to the consumer side. So now we're not looking at Farmer Joe. We're looking at the person who's going and buying Farmer Joe's apples. So in 1888, originally, $1 could buy you 2 pounds of apples and 1 pound of wheat, right? Because apples were 30 cents a pound. So 30 cents times 2, if I bought 2 pounds, would be 60 cents. And then another 40 cents for a pound of wheat would be $1. So my $1 would buy me 2 pounds of apples and 1 pound of wheat. That's how much my $1 would buy me. But now with inflation, 12 years later, $1 can now buy you 2 pounds of apples, but there's not any left over to buy wheat. So now if I wanted to buy 2 pounds of apples and 1 pound of wheat with that inflation, that 10% inflation, those prices, it's now going to cost me $1.10. So before, if I had $1, I could buy 2 pounds of apples and 1 pound of wheat. Now with my same dollar, 12 years later with inflation, I can only buy 2 pounds of apples. So the dollar is worth less in 1900 than it was worth in 1888. It has less purchasing power. I can no longer buy 2 pounds of apples and 1 pound of wheat for $1. It's not worth as much. Just like if you had $50 before inflation, if you had $50 before inflation, you could have bought these popcorn chips. But now after inflation, now it's 75, your $50 ain't gonna cut it. Your $50 is worth less than it used to be because you can no longer buy the same thing. Farmer Joe versus the bank. So with inflation, Farmer Joe, from the farmer's perspective, he's making more money in 1900 than he was in 1888 for selling the same amount of apples and wheat. But he still owes the bank the same amount of money he owed in 1888. Farmer Joe likes inflation. With inflation, the bank loaned Joe $1,000 and was promised to get back $1,100. Now that the dollar is worth less, the value of that $1,100 went down. The bank does not like inflation. I'm going to read that again. So with inflation, Farmer Joe, he's making more money with the inflation in 1900 than he was in 1888, right? We said before inflation, he was making $108. With inflation, he's making $118. So he's making more money, but he's still selling the same amount of apples. He's still selling 10 pounds of apples and 15 pounds of wheat a month, but he's making more money. He still owes the bank $1,100, just like he owed before inflation. So now he has more money to pay off his $1,100 debt than he did without inflation. So he likes it. He's like, yeah, I'm making more money. The money I have to pay back to the bank is no longer as big of a deal because I have more money. Whereas the bank, with inflation, the bank loaned him $1,000 and they were promised to get back $1,100. As the bank, that dollar is no longer worth as much. The value of how much your money can buy went down. Just like this, when this went from 50 to 75, the value of what your money could buy went down. And their money was with Farmer Joe, and they were promised to get money back. And so they do not like inflation. So again, Farmer Joe likes inflation. Anybody who borrows money likes inflation. Anybody who loans their money or invests their money does not like inflation. All right, so let's go back to this gold standard we were talking about. For most of history, gold has been used as a monetary currency in exchange for goods and services. So again, think about like Mesopotamia or Egypt or all of these ancient history times, people just carried gold around with them. And if they wanted to buy your wheat, they would give you gold. But like, look at these gold bars. It's pretty hard to make change with gold bars. And so we in modern times, we substitute paper money and light metal coins. I don't have any, like quarters, pennies, dimes. They're easier to carry than gold because they are easier to carry and they're easier to make change. So again, if you were carrying around a giant gold bar and you were like, oh, I want to buy something from you for this much, they're gonna be like, well, I can't give you change for a gold bar. I can't break it. It's hard to break. So paper money makes that easier. For most of our country's history, our money has been based on the gold standard. This means there was only enough money in circulation to match the reserves of gold that the government had stored in a vault. So again, all of our paper money equaled all the gold stored in a vault. And so again, at any time you could go to the bank and trade in your $20 bill for $20 worth of gold. Everyone in the country could do that at once, and there would be enough for gold for everyone. So then there's this other policy called bimetallism. So again, gold standard is every money is backed on the gold. Bimetallism, think about what bi means. Think like bicycle, or I can't think of any other words starts with bi, but it means two. Bicycle is 2 wheels, or bicentennial is 200 years. So 2 metals. During the late 1800s, many people wanted the United States to incorporate, late 1880s, many people wanted the United States to incorporate silver into the money system as well. This would mean that you could trade in your money for either gold or silver. With there now being gold and silver in the vault, there could be more money in circulation. The farmers liked this idea because more money in the economy leads to higher inflation, and farmers like inflation. Everyone give thumbs up. Farmers like inflation. People who borrow money like inflation. So again, before, all the cash money out in the country was all backed by how much gold was in the vault. So we couldn't make any more, right? Unless we found more gold. The government couldn't say, oh, print out $1,000 and pay these people to do that. And they'd have to say, we need to find $1,000 more of gold so we can pay more people. But now all of a sudden, if it's gold and silver in the vault, Now we kind of doubled our money supply and there's more money in the economy. And when there's more money in the economy, there's inflation. And people who borrow, like farmers, like inflation. So here is your definition of bimetallism, a policy in which the government would give people either gold or silver in exchange for their paper currency. So two metals backing it means twice the amount of money in the economy. All right, the Grange. So let's go. What is the Grange? Small farmers and businesses were also mad at the railroads. So we're kind of going into another reason that the farmers, another people they were mad at. So the farmers wanted the government to go to bimetallism so they could have more money in the economy. And I'm just going to put a pause really quick and think about most of the country at this time were farmers. So don't think like farmers only lived in rural parts. Most people were farmers. For most of our country's history. So there was a lot of farmers and a lot of small businesses. And they were also mad at the railroads. The railroads would charge special low price rates to the big companies that gave them a lot of business. This meant that a big apple farm could afford to sell their apples at 25 cents a pound, where Farmer Joe had to sell his apples for 30 cents a pound. So who's going to sell more apples? Well, you're probably going to buy your apple from the big company that's cheaper than buying it from little Farmer Joe at the farmer's market because it's more expensive. And the railroad companies, they would give these special deals to the big companies because they were always buying railroad tickets for their apples to be transported. And they spent so much money, they'd get a good deal. Just like if you go to, I don't know, Subway 10 times, you get a free sandwich. It's kind of what the railroads were doing. If you're a big family, and you eat Subway all the time and you have 10 kids, you're going to get that free sandwich really quick. But smaller families have to go there a lot to get their free sandwich. So that's kind of what's going on with the railroads. They would get the big companies would get good deals because they used it so often, whereas the small companies didn't use it as much. They wouldn't get as good of a deal. And so it cost more money for Farmer Joe to put his apples on the train to be sold than it cost the giant Apple corporation. So therefore, Farmer Joe has to charge a little bit more money to make his money back. So people start buying all their apples from the big companies, and less from the small farmers. So again, that makes the farmers mad. They don't like that. The Grange was an organization formed to battle against railroads. So today we have political organizations. One that you're probably familiar with is Black Lives Matter. People kind of organize to come up with this or to fight for this political belief and ideology that they have. That's what the Grange was back in the late 1800s. It was a group of farmers who got together to fight against the railroads, and they had that one political belief in common. Populism was a political platform at the day, and it was the movement of the people. So there was a political party called Populism, and it was formed in 1892, so again, late 1800s, and this is what they wanted. So they were making their political party, and they said, this is what we want. And this is what their signs would say when they were out there chanting. They said, we want to increase the money supply with bimetallism. So they, again, wanted gold and silver there so they could have more money in the economy. They wanted a graduated income tax, which we can go over more of this later, but what that means is the more money you make, the higher percentage of your money goes to taxes. So if you make $1 million a year, you might be paying 50% of that to taxes. Whereas if you make $100 a year, you might only pay 2% to taxes. So the more you make, the higher percentage you pay. That's a graduated income tax. We did not have that in the country in the late 1800s. But one of the reasons we have it today is because the Populist Party fought for it. They wanted a federal loan program so you can borrow money from the bank or from the government instead of buying it from the bank. They wanted the direct election of US senators. When the Constitution was written, if you remember, we talked about how each state government got to pick who they sent to the Senate to make laws. The Populist Party, they wanted the people to start voting on who goes to the Senate. They wanted the single term for president, which was only 4 years for presidents and vice presidents. They wanted secret ballots. And we've talked about this a little bit. We said if your boss really likes Trump because Trump was for lower business taxes, and your boss might say, hey, if Biden wins the election, then I have to do something with my company. I might punish my workers, or I might have to fire some of my workers because I have to pay more taxes. And if, let's pretend like when you used to have to go to the ballot, when you would go vote. And again, we've talked about this a little bit before, if you can remember, you'd have to walk on this side if you wanted to vote for Trump, and walk over to this side if you wanted to vote for Biden. And you would put your card in the box, the card that said Trump or the card that said Biden. And like anybody could see you, because you'd see which, like, we'd all be standing in line and we'd watch as you'd go vote and see who you voted for. And if your boss is there, you might want to vote for Biden, but you might be more willing to vote for Trump because you want your boss to see you voting for Trump because your boss was there and your boss wants Trump to win. So one of the things that they were fighting for is for secret ballots. You could take your ballot and you could vote for whoever you want and fold it up and put it in a box and nobody has to know. They also wanted an 8-hour workday and restrictions on immigration. So again, these are the people who are working. It's not just the farmers, it's also the people who are working in the factories, also kind of joined together for this populist movement. And the reason they wanted restrictions on immigration is because a lot of times when immigrants come from poorer countries, they come over to America and they're willing to take any job and they're willing to work for less. So a big business might hire immigrants and only pay them $5 an hour. Whereas if maybe everybody who has already been here for a while is demanding $10 an hour. So if now it's me competing with the immigrant, the business is going to hire the immigrant and only pay $5 an hour. So that's why they wanted restrictions on immigration. So you can kind of look at this and think, which of these did they actually end up getting? I think they ended up, every one of these things has passed except the single term for president, which at the time there was no term limit for presidents. They could have served infinitely forever. But now there's a term limit of only 2 terms. So 8 years, 2 4-year terms. So let's talk about this election of 1896, the last election of the 1800s. You had William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic candidate, and you had William McKinley, who was a Republican candidate. So William Jennings Bryan, he was the Democratic candidate for the 1896 election. And the Democrat Party had adopted kind of the populist platform, which a lot of times happens when third parties rise up. They rise up, they get a lot of people liking them, and then either the Republicans or Democrats say, well, we'll just take those ideals. So if you're on that party, you have to vote for us. So that's kind of what happened. The Democrat Party like swallowed up the Populist Party, and they said, we will also fight for these things. So the Democrat Party started fighting for these things, which today the Democrat Party still fights for a lot of these things. They do fight for like an increase in wages. They do fight for inflation. They do fight for more graduated income tax, more federal loans, and like more restrictions on work. They don't really fight for restrictions on immigration anymore, but they do fight for like workers' rights. So again, a lot of stuff kind of started then and continued to today. Many small farmers and small businesses were voting for William Jennings Bryan. He lost the election. He gave a speech known as the Cross of Gold speech, in which he said, "You shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold." And that's kind of referring to Jesus Christ when he was killed on a cross. They put a crown of thorns on his head. So he's relating to that, and he's trying to say, Labor Party, the people who work at these small businesses and who work at these factories and who are farmers, like he's saying, like big business owners, you can't oppress us like that, and you can't kill us, similar to how Jesus was crucified. And it got a lot of people riled up. It was a really popular speech, and people, like today when people give a big speech like Trump, he said, "Make America great again." People would wear hats and shirts that said MAGA, "Make America great again," kind of like that. He wrote this speech and people were like, "Yeah, cross of gold." And they would like make hats that said cross of gold. I don't know if they made hats, but they would, that was kind of their thing, their rally cry. And then William McKinley, on the other hand, he was the Republican nominee. And a lot of big business tycoons and banks wanted him to win. So people who owned the factories, people who owned the businesses, the people of big businesses who were getting good deals from the railroads, they liked William McKinley because he stood for less regulation on business and less inflation. Teddy Roosevelt was actually a Republican, but he was very progressive. And Teddy Roosevelt kind of liked these things. And so the Republican Party said, well, let's put him as William McKinley's vice president, because vice presidents don't have a lot of power. And so if we make him vice president, he can't really say anything. And then it looks like he's a big deal, but he's not. But then the second election, William McKinley, when Roosevelt was his VP, he was assassinated kind of right away. And so that's how Teddy Roosevelt became president. All right, pause this. So these are this was your notes for today. Go ahead and get out your Wizard of Oz video notes. I want to go through those. I'm going to pause the video and go ahead and get those out. All right, so let's take a look. Now that we understand a little bit more the Gilded Age, let's see if we can see kind of how the Wizard of Oz related to that. So we said that the Scarecrow represented the farmer, and he's the one who needed a brain. So they said, you know, the farmer might seem kind of naive and dumb, but in reality, the Scarecrow is the smartest one in the story. The Tin Man was the industrial labor, the person who worked at the factories. And they said that he's the one who needed a heart. And they said the big factories made him less of a human because he worked there, and they didn't see him as a man. They just saw him as a machine who works there all day. So it's like they took out his heart. And they said the Cowardly Lion was that guy, William Jennings Bryan, this guy who ran for president. And they said he was a coward because he didn't fight for the silver standard. So they said he was the Cowardly Lion, and he needed his courage. And if he had the nerve to move to the silver standard, he would have been a courageous lion. The Yellow Brick Road in the story represents the gold standard, whereas the Munchkins are the common people, and not the farmers, not the small business owners, but they wanted to keep the gold standards. That's why the Munchkins sing follow the Yellow Brick Road, because they're saying keep the gold standard. The Wicked Witch, she was the Wicked Witch. She represented the evil rich people in the East, like the banks and monopolies. Again, I put evil in quotes because this is how people think the author portrayed these people. I'm not saying that people who own banks and who own big businesses in the East Coast were evil. That's not coming from me. That's coming from this particular theory that that's what the Wicked Witch stood for. Whereas Emerald City, where she wants to go, she gets to Emerald City. It's all green. Emerald is a green stone. It's all green. And they say that represented Washington, D.C., and everything is green, and all they care about is money. And the silver slippers, remember at the very end of the story, the good witch says, oh, you've had the answer the whole time. I gave you these slippers. And in the movie, they're red. She said, your ruby red slippers, that's what's going to get you home. Because Dorothy, the whole time, she's just trying to find how to get home. And the good witch tells her, well, your slippers will get you there. But in the book, they were silver. So the book, the original story, they said, oh, the answer to your problem, you've had it all along. It's just silver. If we add silver to the gold standard and move to bimetallism, all of our problems will be solved. And they say that Oz, the Wizard of Oz, OZ is our abbreviation for ounces. So it could have been ounces in the silver debate. And again, we don't know if this is really what the author had in mind when he wrote The Wizard of Oz, but this is a theory, and it kind of matches pretty well, so it's kind of cool. Anyway, so if you are done with your notes, you can go ahead and turn them in, and there is a reflection for you to do. William versus McKinley versus Bryan. They're both named William. And this is on page 99 in your workbook, and you can read through, and there's going to be two people it talks about, and based on what you know, decide which one would have probably voted for McKinley and which one would have probably voted for Bryan. Again, Bryan's probably going to be people who were farmers or had small businesses, and McKinley's probably going to be somebody who does not want inflation and who owns a business. And when you're done, you can turn it into the bin. If you don't finish, you can go ahead and take it home and turn it in on Monday. And have a great weekend.